Hey you all. This is part two of the Timaeus dialogue by Plato that I'm doing. As you know, part one was about Atlantis, but today we're not doing conspiracy theories, although I do like aliens and the paranormal. But this one is important because this part of the dialogue is Timaeus's account of creation. And what's interesting is that I'd read that the ancient Greeks thought that the universe was eternal, and they believed in the gods, and what was it, like Oceanus was the first god or something, and blah blah blah, like the gods are creating each other. But this one's a very unique creation story, and it's like Genesis. It can be useful, and I think it could be useful in looking at the Bible and that creation story. So yeah, let's just get into it. So before Timaeus gives his creation story, we learn that Timaeus is an astronomer, and so that's why Socrates asks him to give a speech on creation first, because he is an expert. But what's interesting is that Timaeus does not give any astronomical details first. He actually begins with very vague metaphysical principles. One, there is a part of reality that is unchanging, and there is a part that is changing. And two, the part which is unchanging is always grasped by one's reason, and that which is changing is grasped by the senses. So yeah, three, reason forms wisdom, and the senses form opinions. And he sums this up with that this beautiful line: as being is to becoming, so is truth to belief. So as you can see, these are the beginnings of the Platonic dualist view, that there is an intelligible world which contains the unchanging things, and then there's the visible world which contains the changing things. So this is a combination of Parmenides and Heraclitus. So the first question I have is, which part of reality does the world belong to? Our world. According to Timaeus, the world must have been created because it is visible and tangible, and because changing things are, but because the visible and tangible change, then they have to be created. Because if you change, that means um, you must you must have come from something that was different. Like you must have changed states, and so therefore there has to be a cause. So things that change must not have always existed in the past. So another point in the Timaeus is that Timaeus doesn't call the creator the demiurge in this one. This edition is the MIT archive version, so he calls it the deity, or God, or the creator. So first, Timaeus says that the deity, or the demiurge, looked upon a pattern to create the physical, visible world, and that this pattern is like the blueprint for it. And this pattern is eternal and unchangeable. Um, so that shows how the demiurge imparted intelligibility onto the physical world by something that was intelligible to begin with. So this is the most probable explanation for creation. Um, and so Timaeus advises us not to go any further in inquiring about this, because not because he wants to shut down everyone, but because he says that you can't articulate perfection. You can't, our mind cannot comprehend creation, so he leaves it up to the elders and the mystics and the gods, um, visions and stuff to reveal those types of things. So Timaeus' God is generous, um, in the respect that God shares his goodness with the rest of creation, and God created the world out of this primordial chaos that preceded it. And this resembles Genesis because that's what God did in Genesis. Timaeus' creation story resembles Genesis's in the respect that when God said, "Let there be light," he made the darkness that preceded creation intelligible. Indeed, the Bible tells tells us that there was a mass before creation and something with the character of being a thing, but it would not have been comprehensible by our reason if God did not make it so. And this reminds me of Thomas Aquinas' idea of prime matter, because we can't comprehend how matter can exist without form. And it was this prime matter that existed before creation that God used and imparted intelligibility or form into it to make creation. So Timaeus' God, being unjealous, desired that all things should be good and nothing bad, so far as this was attainable. Now, this brings up the metaphysical question of evil, because, I guess the dilemma is, if God is all good and all powerful, then why does evil exist? Well, my explanation that I've gotten from the Timaeus is that if God is perfect and creation is not God, then therefore creation has to be imperfect by its own nature. And so there, even though God is omnipotent, then there are still some things that God cannot do just logically. Like God cannot make a square round by definition. He can't do that. That violates the laws of logic. And this, of course, brings up other questions like, well, is God above the laws of logic? If he's not, are the laws of logic the same as God? And this goes into like the medieval Muslim debates on whether God is an essence or is he an attribute. So yeah, I'm not going to get into that because that's out of the scope of this. But anyways, in one way, the Christian God is pure existence. Contrast the Christian God with the chaos or darkness that preceded creation. In both the Timaeus and Genesis, we have the primordial chaos. That's non-existence. And you can think of non-existence as like the Buddhist non-existence. So it's not nothing, but it's still nothing. There's no independently existing essence like God. There's no supreme pure being or pure actuality. So this chaos, primordial chaos, was non-existence. Note that non-existence is not completely nothing. You can think of it as like a black hole. A black hole is not nothing, but it's like an absence of I guess light and gravity or whatever. I'm not a scientist. But yes, you can also think of it according to Parmenides, who said that what is and what is not is not. All we can think of is what is. So, because God made creation in the likeness of the intelligible world, the visible world must be a combination of the non-existence that preceded it and the existence or the intelligibleness that God imparted onto it. So it's a mixture. Created existence must have metaphysical black holes within it. Our soul is immortal, but the body is not. Our soul does not change, but the body is subject to decay. Goodness, the good, God, he does not change and he's eternal and perfect, but evil is not its own essence. It depends on our free will to create it. So therefore you can call evil non-existence or a black hole, morally speaking. But why can't God just make the world perfect, you ask? Well, I think you can answer this, like I'm going to stretch this and say, in the sense that he did make the world perfect, because by sending Jesus Christ, he put infinity into finiteness. I mean, what more can you do? Like the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, he even said, how can you be infinite and finite at the same time? So here, God violates the laws of logic, and he sends Jesus down. He comes down as a man. So yes, that just shows his omnipotence. And Jesus Christ triumphed over evil, but those who reject him cannot see it. For those of us who are unenlightened, we create that black hole that swallows up the light. While in one sense it is up to us now to accept him, we must also hope for something greater than light or knowledge. God has already made chaos into light for us to see, and he has had to send light itself down for us to live. But the final judgment awaits. And anyways, seeing that intelligence cannot reside in anything without a soul, TIMAEUS's God set out to place intelligence in souls and souls in bodies. Hence, the world became a living creature because there were all these, things with souls in them. We can see a strand develop between Plato and Pythagoras when they thought that anything that was alive, grew, and could take up nutrition had a soul. You can contrast this with John Locke, who just called it life. He didn't really, I guess, believe in the Platonic soul, because he thought that it would lead to reincarnation and stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's much more easier saying that the soul is the substrate that explains why the body changes or why things change in this world. It's just more easier than saying life, because life is more of like a nominalist concept that just exists in our mind. Life is not really an actual thing like a soul is. Life is not an immaterial substance. It's just a concept, like a concept in our mind, and it only exists in the mind. But anyways, Timaeus then goes on to say, on the eternal pattern that the demiurge uses to create the physical world. He says it like it's an image of an animal, or the demiurge is using images like the eternal pattern. And I think of it like a quilt or something. The demiurge is crafting the physical world. He's like stitching up another quilt based off of this like perfect eternal quilt. And I know the demiurge has to be perfect, but just for the sake of being a copy of the perfect eternal quilt, the new quilt cannot be perfect. Otherwise, it would be the same as the eternal quilt. I know that's kind of like a weird, obscure explanation. That's how I think of it. But anyways, if the creator used the image of an animal to model the world from, it cannot be an image of one animal, for one animal is only a part of its species, but its species is only a part of all life. The creator must have used an image of the very whole, which comprehends or contains the designs for all life. So you can see already, Timaeus, he anticipates David Hume, who said that in nature, things are only individuals. So there is no such thing as this general idea or general concept, because even concepts themselves are particulars. And like, we have a concept of triangularity, but even that concept itself is an image, because like when we have ideas, usually they're images of something. We don't have an idea of a concept that isn't an image. And so Timaeus says that this image must also be able to contain all other images and all other particulars in it, just like Immanuel Kant called pure concepts as containing all possible experience, which then he calls the transcendental deduction, where we can know things because we have pure concepts in our mind that we deduce from. But anyways, this deity must have framed one visible animal to comprehend all other animals. I think of what is being framed into the image of an animal as Timaeus's prototype for Plato's forms. This image of an animal is what all other animals participate in to be animals. However, for Timaeus, there can only be one form or image for animals. For if there was another form, all animals would participate in two things and lose their resemblance to the original image of the animal. While there can be many visible and tangible things, there can only be one intelligible thing for those particulars to derive their existence from. In response to the Milesian philosopher Anaximander's theory of an infinite universe, Timaeus establishes that while there can be many worlds, there can only be one in heaven. Secondly, What is created must be corporeal, and vice versa, just like what is uncreated must be incorporeal. Echoing Empedocles, Timaeus states that between air and fire, there must be another substance to bring two things together. So between two things, there must be a third to bring them together. The two things he calls earth and water. But for some reason, what I don't understand, the third thing is fire and air, although those are two things. But anyways, um, as a result of these elements coming together, only their creator can bring them apart or destroy them. So already we have an anticipation of the law of conservation of matter. And Timaeus calls this coming together like a principle of friendship. And just like Empedocles said, he called the principles of coming together and coming apart love and strife. Love would be the principle of attraction. That's how elements come together and create the world. And then strife is when they come apart, like entropy. So, as to the shape of the universe, just like Parmenides, Timaeus says that the shape has to be a globe because, in one sense, when you have a globe, no edge or corner, well, there is no edge and corner, and so there is no place where it's further apart from the center. All of the circumference is equidistant to the center. And two, the globe comprehends all other shapes. So in those two senses, it's perfect. Psychologized, you can think of Eric Neumann when he talks about the sphere or the circle as like the symbol of perfection. It's why all these mystics use it, just like the Ouroboros and stuff. But just to quote him, he says, "Circle, sphere, and round are all aspects of the self-contained, which is without beginning and end. For in its roundness there is no before and after, no time, and there is no above and no below, no space. All this can only come with the coming of light, of consciousness, which is not yet present. Now all is underway for the unmanifest Godhead, whose symbol is therefore the circle." Okay, now I'm going to be silly. I think this is why when I'm reading this like little kid's version of the Bible to my cousin, in the first page of creation, it just shows the primordial chaos as like this purple like sphere. I think that's probably I don't know, like my amateur psychologized view of like why people think of it as like a dark globe. But anyways, perhaps we can look at the Christian God with this perspective. If God does not need anything, he makes creation of this world all the more generous. Because God is self-sufficient. So why did he create the world? He's perfect. So this selfless action explains why creation is imperfect, because it's lacking the self or God that created it. Timaeus does not speak of the creator forming a soul from within the corporeal universe, but he speaks of the soul of which the corporeal universe lies within. And this is a very weird concept because I always thought when I think of souls, I picture like, a heart kind of thing, or like, when philosophers talk about like, well, what if a rock has a soul? Then I think of like this like thing like in a rock moving around. And that's just because we can't comprehend the idea of a soul or an immaterial substance because how can we think of anything without shape or color or whatever or extension? So it's just very weird to think that rather than a soul that resides in matter, matter resides in the soul. I think that's a very profound concept. So after the creator formed the soul, forming it from being, sameness, and difference, he united it with the material universe within her. Okay, just for a footnote, sameness and difference are two principles that appear in Plotinus's Enneads. And so Plotinus was a Neoplatonist, so he's like 600 years after Plato wrote this. And sameness and difference are principles he uses to describe the divine mind or the intellect. And so the divine mind or intellect is the same as its ideas. And so that's why I think he uses the principle of sameness and difference, because the ideas in the mind are the same as well as different. And there's like a whole like reason for this. I can just tell you really quickly. Because Plotinus incorporated Aristotle and Plato in his philosophy. Aristotle said that only ideas can exist in the mind, whereas Plato was an idealist. So he said only ideas exist. So if you combine them, you can say ideas exist in the divine mind. So anyways, back to the TIMAEUS. Then the creator imparted movement and life onto the universe, an image of the eternal gods. If we were to look at Christian angels from the Platonist perspective, could we say that the angels are moving and living? And just as the deity's creation is to be an image of the eternal intelligible world, the deity set out to make the universe eternal. Even for a deity, he could not make created things eternal. So he made time the moving image of eternity. Time moves according to number, while eternity rests in unity. Very important concepts and very poetic. Just as time and the heavens, which is outer space, were created together, so would they be abolished together, as opposed to the idea that time and space will become non-existent when the mind is not present to experience objects in them. That's something that the idealists and like the obscure German people think, like, oh, if there's no matter, there's no time, blah blah blah. Or if like we're not there to experience it, it doesn't exist. There's no mind, then it doesn't exist. In Kant's metaphysics, time and space are not things in themselves, but are conditions of our experience. Yet Timaeus surprisingly claims that the created heaven is and will be in all time. And just like in the Bible, it says God created the heaven and the earth. So this heaven, while it was created, it will exist in all time. So it's not outside of time, but it's in all of time. So this, I think, is the reason why the Greeks believed in the eternity of the universe. Probably, I think, just because it will go on forever. The planets and their orbits, Timaeus claims, were created by God to serve as a way of marking time, demonstrating the connection between the movement of the parts of space and intervals of time. And so, just like amateur psychology, I would assume that because like ancient Greeks used sundials and stuff and like astronomy, that's why they thought that the planets were there. God gave us the planets so that we can tell time. He gave us the sun so we can tell time. Timaeus' deity then creates the Greek pantheon, addressing even Zeus and Hera as my creations. Logically, the gods are not immortal by their own essences because the deity didn't make them immortal. He didn't like they weren't there before they were created, but they're dissoluble as created things. But metaphysically, the gods will never be dissolved, Timaeus says, because the deity tells them, I will make you live on forever. So it's because of the deity that they live on forever, not because they're just so powerful that they live on forever. And you can see this in St. Thomas Aquinas when he talks about the angels. He has a concept for it, the eviternity, I don't know how to pronounce Latin, Aevertenity. Because the angels, they live and they exist in time and they change, between mental states. They can fall and they can convert or whatever. So obviously they're subject to change, but their essences don't change. And because he's an Aristotelian, Thomas Aquinas believes that the angels' essences are what makes them so or whatever. So in that sense, the angels are eviternal because while they were created and they can change, they will still live on forever. So if God existed in time, like the rest of us, like heaven and the angels, we would fall into the problem of time being um, being superior to God, like how Kronos, the god of time, created Zeus. So I always wonder then God must be outside of time. In order for the universe to be universal, the deity tasked the gods to create um, like all the physical things, like the bodies of human beings, um, all the animals, all the things that ought to exist. And just looking at the term universal, it means the totality of existing things. So the gods are tasked with filling all the levels of existence with created things. But it is unclear whether Plato regards the heavenly bodies or planets as the gods, because he does mention Mercury and Venus, but I don't know if he means to call them gods because he attributes some like anthropomorphic characteristics to them, but I'm not sure if they are gods themselves. But Timaeus does call night and day the eldest of gods, with Earth as their guardian. Um, and these elder gods live in the interior of heaven, while the heavenly bodies are spread across the universe, shining in perfect globular shapes. So these heavenly bodies belong to two classes. One, those which are already perfect and move on the same spot in the same manner. And two, those which follow the perfect. So planets would be two, and one would be stars. So the planets follow or orbit around the stars. And you can see this in Aristotle because Timaeus says that uh, the planets, or no, sorry, the fixed stars think about their own thoughts. And for Aristotle later, he says that thinking about thinking is the highest form of being, as opposed to like practical thinking, thinking to get through life. But thinking about thinking, contemplating the higher ideals, is the highest form of being. And it's the same with the planets. When explaining the prime mover in the movement of the heavenly bodies, why they move in perfect circles, he says that the planets desire, they move from desire. They're not pushed upon, but they move through their own desire to emulate the perfection of like the unmoved mover who's like perfect. And because circles are the perfect shape, they desire to move in perfect circles. But anyways, the earth, Timaeus says, clings to a pole that goes through the universe. And just like Kant, who threw out the metaphysical questions about, where did the universe come from, blah, 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 Timaeus leaves it up to the men of old times to give us an explanation because it's just beyond our comprehension. Reason cannot explain like why all this happened. But what Timaeus does claim is that the deity created all souls from the leftover mixture. So if you remember those elements, earth, wind, fire, and air that were like mixing together and they were like coming together, there's some leftover gloop or whatever that from when the world's soul or all of the animals or whatever were created and like the world became alive. There's some leftover elements, but because they've been mixed together, they're diluted. That's why when the deity makes the rest of the souls from this diluted mixture, that's why the souls are impure, because they're not as pure as the world's soul. But anyways, the deity assigns these other souls to the planets. And so he says they're placed in chariots with the planets as their horses, and the planets lead them around the universe. They bring them across the universe. And that's why they're said to have like acquired all of this divine knowledge because the planets are leading them across the universe in the chariots. And then Timaeus says, these souls are called the souls of human beings. And if they live immorally, then in their next life, they're embodied in a woman. And if they still don't learn their lesson, they're embodied in a brute or a barbarian. And if when they finally learn their lesson, they're returned to their native star. So you can see this is like the beginning of like astrology. This is the foundation, because I know the Babylonians believed in astrology. But yeah, this is like a philosophical foundation for astrology. After the deity creates human souls, he tasks the gods with creating their physical bodies, and he tells them that the gods should guide them and stop them from like doing harm to others and like destroying a city. But if the human beings hurt themselves, the gods can't do anything about it. Human beings should be free to inflict harm on themselves, from their own stupidity. But for some reason, when the souls of men are embodied, although the fabric of the universe, spun and woven by the deity, is so perfectly tethered, when the soul is falling towards the body, all the elements are like bashing it and they're striking it, and so this disorients the soul. So when it's embodied, that's why it's born without intelligence. It doesn't know the forms. It doesn't know the deity or anything. That's why I guess they say babies are born without knowledge. But eventually, the partitions of the soul, like the appetite, the spirit, the rational faculty, they settle down and they return to their normal revolutions. And eventually, they'll become rational and able to be educated and nurtured. But only through education can they be brought up. That's another thing, because I never thought that Plato would advocate for education. I thought he was more of like an innate idea, the kind of person. But then Socrates does say in the Meno that innate ideas are awakened only through questioning. Then TIMAEUS briefly touches upon epistemology. He says that sense perception is not merely caused by elements making contact with, the sense organs, but by the motions of the elements reaching the soul. So you can picture that like psychological diagram with the butterfly on the outside, and when our vision sees it, it's like turned upside down in the back of our head. I know that's not really like what happens, but that's just like a picture. It's very interesting because he's like the first to say that the mind is also involved in our sense perception. Also, he talks about visual rays. I know he's not a scientist, but like I guess this is like a foundation for optics. Not only do we have a field of vision, but TIMAEUS says that light is required to be reflected off objects. That's why we can see them. So only invisible souls can have mind, while visible bodies do not, and can only produce chance effects. So what is the purpose of the soul, and why is it receptive to the senses? The soul cannot possibly be purposed for perceiving material objects for the sake of perceiving them. This is where the Platonists depart from Aristotle, because Aristotle believes, the senses and reason and our soul are there because, we desire well-being and happiness and stuff. But TIMAEUS is like, that can't be the only reason. Like there must be a higher purpose. So TIMAEUS says, sight, in my opinion, is the source of the greatest benefit to us. For had we never seen the stars, the sun, and the heaven, none of the words which we have spoken about the universe would have ever been uttered. Very profound. And I agree with him. So, experiencing the change that is the essence of this physical world, we form a concept of number and subsequently time. Time as a succession of impressions, whether they be internal events, like our mental states, or external ones, like our perceptions, is here given a definition that Kant and Schopenhauer will use to describe the internal sense. With this concept of time in our minds, we are able to pursue philosophy, the greatest gift of all. But yet it appears that this gift is not simply given, just like God's love is not simply given. We have to be open to accept it. We have to realize that there's a higher purpose for human beings. We are embodied souls. we're not just here to have fun and be happy. There's a higher purpose to us. Gifts are not only given but are received, and we must be open to God's love, just as we must be open to wisdom. Timaeus' deity grants man sight, so that we may observe the intelligent movements of the celestial bodies. Speech is a gift for such purposes as well, so that we may learn the natural truth of reason. For Aristotle, the inverse is the case, because in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says that reason is there for our well-being. We have a hand to defend ourselves, and we have sight to see things in the physical world. There's no contemplation of outer space. There's nothing like that. It's all practical. And so in that respect, he's a secular humanist. I would say. I'm not an expert, but that's my assessment. So this is the Aristotelian tradition grounds Timaeus's metaphysics. But when Aristotle says that nature endowed men with reason so that they could be virtuous and thus happy, I always wonder about the truth of that statement, because Kant says, if nature intended us to be happy, why would it give us reason? Here, the Platonic influence on philosophy appears, and we can see that happiness is not the proper aim of the soul, nor is it the reason why we are given heavenly gifts. According to Timaeus, hearing is a gift, so that we may hear sounds that comprise harmonies which heal the soul, and notice rhythms which we can use as models to live our life with balance, much like how Aristotle theorized about Greek tragedy and catharsis. Timaeus reveals that he has been holding back in the first part of his speech, and reveals that he was withholding a third element in his metaphysics. So that will be for part 3. So stay tuned. I know I left you on the cliff of suspense, but I really hope that all these profound quotes set into you, and that you can contemplate more on the idea of a soul, and that there's more to life than just having fun and being happy. So thank you. Bye.